Somewhere, in the fields of Gaul, on the docks of Alexandria, in the markets of Chang'an, people looked up and saw a sky that had forgotten how to be blue. The sun still rose, but it gave no warmth. It cast no shadow where there should have been light. And it stayed that way, not for a day, not for a week, for an entire year. A silent veil of ash draped across the atmosphere, strangling the seasons and unmanning the harvests. Historical records from the period describe the sensation with chilling precision. The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, hollowed out. A star that had gone through the motions of rising, but forgotten why. Modern science calls this a volcanic winter, but science, for all its instruments, cannot name the source. The sky of the 6th century remains, by its own admission, a cold, dark mystery. Isaiah had already named it. But to understand what Isaiah was naming, we have to first understand what was holding the world together. After the great flood, God made a promise, not a sentiment, not a hope, a covenant, sealed into the foundations of creation itself, the Noahide covenant, a unilateral guarantee of planetary stability, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, the rhythms of the earth locked into place so long as humanity remained within the boundaries of natural law. This was the everlasting covenant, the architecture beneath civilization itself. But this stability was never unconditional. By the mid-6th century, that architecture had not merely bent, it had snapped. From the systemic corruption of legal proceedings to an empire-wide indifference to the suffering of the poor, the inhabitants of the earth had done precisely what Isaiah 24:5 describes. They had transgressed the laws, changed the ordinances, broken the everlasting covenant. And the earth answered. 536 AD was not random geological chaos. It was what Isaiah calls the activation of a penalty clause, a cosmic flip. When the index of justice collapsed, the physical world mirrored the collapse. The Hebrew tradition has a name for this: Hester Panim, the hiding of the face. The light that sustains physical life withdrawn, because the moral pillars sustaining it had been removed. The stratospheric ash was not the cause of the darkness. It was the expression of it. As Isaiah would later say, the sun grew ashamed, and the earth began to reel and stagger. The physical world begins its violent unraveling. Verse 1.
Behold, the Lord empties the land and lays it waste, and he shall turn over its face and scatter its inhabitants.
Here's where it begins. The earth appears to be hollowed out. There is a sense of a great emptying, as if the very resources of the land are being withdrawn. In the year 536, the sun's warmth vanished, and with it, the life force of the soil. Procopius noted that the sun gave forth its light without brightness throughout this year. Without the energy of the sun, the land became a waste, unable to provide for the billions of tiny lives that depended on its fertility. But then, the earth's very skin begins to warp, the surface begins to twist. In the city of Antioch in 526, eyewitnesses recorded a scene of terrifying distortion. The very earth was seen to be boiling. For a society that anchored its identity in the eternal stability of Roman stone, the literal liquefaction of the ground was a psychological twisting as much as a physical one. It turned their world into a Kiryat Tohu, a city of formlessness, shattering their perception of reality before the sun even dimmed. 2 years later, the earth groaned again, striking the same broken city, a relentless twisting of the crust that defied any attempt at rebuilding. Social boundaries vanish in a chilling, forced equality. Verse 2.
And it shall be, as with the people, so with the priest, as with the servant, so with his master, as with the maid, so with her mistress, As with the buyer, so with her seller. As with the lender, so with the borrower. As with the creditor, so with the debtor.
As the climate shifts and the light fails, now here's what makes this terrifying. The plague didn't care who you were. In the natural world, a deep freeze or a virulent pathogen does not distinguish between the towering oak and the grass at its feet. The artificial hierarchies of civilization simply dissolved under the weight of the earth out of balance. The first place the silence hit was the sanctuary. The spiritual shield offered no protection. John of Ephesus watched as the plague moved through the monasteries with indifferent precision. He saw priests found dead at their own altars and whole communities erased in a single season. High and low stood equal in a world that cast no shadows. Within the great houses of Constantinople, the master sat alone in a marble hall, waiting for a servant who would never come. In the market, commerce ground to a halt. Humanity was being reduced to its most basic biological elements. The landscape is scoured, hollowed of its vital essence. Verse 3.
The earth shall be utterly emptied and utterly plundered, for the Lord has spoken this word.
And then it gets worse. It is as if the earth is being vacuumed of its very essence. Travellers in the frozen provinces of the east recorded a terrifying silence. One could walk for days between skeletal ruins without seeing a single living soul. But even as life withdrew, the human state began to plunder what little remained. The empire kept taxing starving populations even as entire districts emptied. It was consuming the last reserves of its own survival. This was a biological plundering, an ecological bankruptcy, where the state consumed the last seeds of its own future. On a mystical level, this devastation is absolute because the Lord has spoken this word. This is the suspension of the foundational decree that sustains our world. The Lord has spoken refers to the specific speech that anchors the Noahide covenant, the divine guarantee that seed time and harvest, summer and winter, would never cease. In Isaiah's framework, when humanity violates the foundations of justice, the sustaining harmony of the world itself begins to withdraw. The earth is a living mirror of human conduct. When it is emptied, it is because the vital, holy energy that fuels the physical matrix has been retracted. The word of stability is replaced by the word of sifting, leaving behind a physical vacuum where the reality of the land simply evaporates. A slow, agonizing winter withers the global elite. Verse 4.
The earth mourns and withers, the world fades and withers. The highest people of the earth languish.
As the dust veil settles, a chilling silence falls across the biosphere. And then it gets worse, a slow, agonizing decline. In the northern forests, the annual rings of the great oaks show almost zero growth. With temperatures plummeting by some 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit, the very mechanism of life, photosynthesis, begins to fail. While such a drop might sound modest, in climatological terms, it was a catastrophic shift, a sudden cooling that pushed the temperate Mediterranean into a brutal Siberian climate. The foundation of life crumbles, and the highest people of the earth languish. In 536 AD, the highest people of the earth consisted of the Byzantine senatorial class, the Sassanid Persian Wuzurgan, and the refined aristocracy of China's northern and southern dynasties. These global elites were defined by their total control over land and the ordinances of law, yet they were the first to languish when the caloric foundation of their power collapsed. As the volcanic dust veil triggered a global cooling, the Byzantine possessores watched their Mediterranean estates fail, while the Chinese nobility saw their refined court culture buried under yellow snow and famine. This was not merely a financial decline, but a systemic withering, where the plague eventually bypassed their marble walls to strike down emperors like Justinian himself, proving that the high-ranking officials, the Magi of Persia, and the warlords of the East were all equally vulnerable to an earth that had withdrawn its support from humanity. But here's what makes this catastrophe different from every other collapse in history. A few people survived, and what they did next will change everything. Spiritual toxicity poisons the very foundation of life. Verse 5.
The earth is also defiled under its inhabitants, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, and broken the everlasting covenant.
This verse is the engine of the entire chapter, the why behind the falling sky. The Hebrew word for defiled is chanpah, which suggests a spiritual toxicity so dense it alters the physical nature of the soil. On a mystical level, the earth is a covenant partner. It responds to what humanity does. It was designed to receive human conduct and translate it into agricultural output. Many later interpreters would read the disasters of the 6th century through precisely this lens. When Isaiah speaks of the everlasting covenant, he is referring to the Noachide contract of planetary stability. This was a biological agreement. Humanity provides justice, and the earth provides bread. By violating the Noachide laws, specifically the prohibitions against theft, sexual immorality, and cruelty to living things, humanity physically poisoned the land. The earth became chanpah, contaminated. It was no longer a host, but a victim. The earth itself responded, not randomly, but as the consequence of a breached covenant, leading to the atmospheric collapse we see in 536 AD. The breach of contract triggers an inescapable penalty. Verse 6.
Therefore a curse has devoured the earth, and those who dwell in it are held guilty. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are scorched, and few men are left.
We move from the breach of contract to the execution of the penalty. In the Hebrew, this curse is an Allah, a specific oath-bound consequence built into the Noachide structure. To the survivors, the earth no longer felt stable or protective. Nature itself seemed to turn hostile. The mystical interpretation here is that the earth was forced to sift its inhabitants. The scorching, charu, mentioned here refers to the fever of the Justinian Plague, but also to a deeper spiritual heat. When the beneficial light of the sun was withdrawn, verse 23, it was replaced by the scorching light of judgment. Those who dwell in it are held guilty, ashamu, a word that implies a state of desolation where the legal weight of their actions physically empties the landscape. Few men are left, mizar enosh, and that's exactly what the witnesses describe, stunned silence. John of Ephesus describes walking through provinces where the sifting was so radical that people seemed to have vanished. He writes of vineyards where the grapes rotted because there was no one to harvest them, and of vast cities where the only sound was the wind through empty streets. It was a thinning of the earth, a moment where the shaking of the tree left only a tiny, traumatized remnant to witness the end of the ancient world. Bitterness replaces the natural sweetness of the earth. Verse 7.
The new wine mourns, the vine languishes, all the merry-hearted sigh.
This is the onset of a trophic cascade, a total biological blackout. Mystically, this tirosh or new wine refers to the natural sweetness of the world. When the Noachide covenant, that ancient pact of stability, collapses, God removes the sugar and the joy from physical matter itself. The lack of solar energy meant the sap, the literal life force of the earth, could not flow. The earth became a biological corpse. The psi, Neentia, is a deep, soul-level exhaustion, the sound of a world that has forgotten how to be happy, because the hope for the future has failed. Consider the vine. It is an organism that lives entirely for the sun. But in this strange twilight world of the 6th century, the light has lost its potency. The landscape itself is being stripped of something fundamental. Across the rolling hills of Gaul and Italy, the grapes, once swollen with sweetness, now hang small, bitter and green, or simply rot on the stem in the damp, sunless chill. They lack the vital energy required to transform sunlight into sugar. When photosynthesis fails, the new wine isn't just missing. It is physically impossible. The wine mourns, the harp goes silent. But in the silence, something unexpected begins, and we'll see it soon. A terrifying silence falls over the bustling centres. Verse 8.
The joy of the beat of the drums stops, the uproar of the joyful ceases, the joy of the harp stops.
Listen to the silence. In the once bustling heart of the Mediterranean world, the soundscape has undergone a profound and chilling shift. The rhythmic pulse of life, the drum or toff, which once echoed through every street festival and wedding, has quite simply vanished. The Shan, that great bustling uproar of human pride in the Roman forums and the wealthy courts, is extinguished, replaced by a heavy, atmospheric dread. Even the most delicate of sounds are lost. The kinnah, the harp that represents the individual soul, has stopped its vibration. John of Ephesus provides a haunting witness to this void. He writes of walking through the eastern provinces and finding only the silence of the streets, where the heartbeat of civilization had been replaced by the occasional, lonely cry of a mourner. Companionship turns sour under a stressed, sunless sky. Verse 9.
In song they shall not drink wine. Strong drink shall become bitter to those who drink it.
In this darkened world, rituals of companionship turn sour. Mandaean texts record grain at impossible prices. When grain is unaffordable, brewing ceases. Without the sun, the barley is stunted and thin. When fermented, it produces defensive tannins and a biting acidity that makes the drink physically bitter to the tongue. This is the chemical betrayal of the shekhar, the strong drink, or Hebrew beer. The ritual of the toast, the drinking in song, is a memory. Because the sun had lost its strength, the barley plants remained in a state of stress, leaving only a bitter reminder of a world being purged by its creator. Civilization itself uncreates into a city of formlessness. Verse 10.
The city of chaos is shattered to pieces. Every house is shut tight so that no one can enter.
This is the moment where civilization uncreates itself. The Kiryat Tohu, the city of formlessness, is not just an ancient ruin. This could have felt like Constantinople itself, returning to the void of Genesis 1:2. Procopius provides the terrifying autopsy of a metropolis that became a necropolis. He describes bodies stacked in the towers of the fortifications because the ground was too full to receive them. He tells of forums emptied of life and ships drifting aimlessly in the Golden Horn, their crews dead at the oars. The great order of the Roman world, which once claimed to be eternal, was revealed as an illusion. The city was shattered to pieces not by a siege of men, but by a siege of silence. The forums, once the heart of human pride, became hollow spaces where the only movement was the dust of the dead. Every house was shut tight, not to protect property, but as a desperate failed barricade against an invisible threat that no wall could stop, that had already climbed through the windows. The metropolis was being scoured of its form, leaving only the skeletal remains of a world that had forgotten its foundation. Joy is driven out, replaced by atmospheric dread. verse 11.
In the streets they cry out for wine. All joy turned to darkness. The world's happiness has been exiled.
This is desperation, not abstract, but physical. Joy was not merely lost, it was gala, exiled, driven out of the world like a refugee. John of Ephesus makes this intimate. He walked through the villages and saw the bridal chambers where the laughter of a wedding was suddenly replaced by the rattle of death. He speaks of brides who became corpses before the feast was even finished. In the streets, the cry for wine was the cry for a memory of warmth in a world that had turned cold and dark. People started writing their names on tablets and hanging them on their arms, not as ritual, but as a final message for whoever might find their body in the morning. This was the blackout of the human spirit. Joy became a foreign concept, a ghost that could no longer find a home in the hearts of a population that lived in a state of perpetual mourning. Every door is shut, but behind one of those doors, someone is writing a prayer that will outlast the empire. Desolation shatters the final thresholds of human safety. Verse 12.
Nothing but desolation is left in the city. Its gates are battered into ruins.
We arrive at the state of Shamama, a desolation so empty it causes the soul to be stunned. In Roman culture, the open door was the primary symbol of civilization, safety, and law. But in the mid-6th century, the threshold itself was shattered. The boundary between the safety of the hearth and the chaos of the void was obliterated. The gates were not just the heavy iron of the city walls, they were the thresholds of every individual home. Every door became a barricade, yet no barricade held. The plague came through every threshold, proving that there was no sanctuary left on the earth. The monumental architecture of the Roman world was literally falling apart because there were no longer enough hands to maintain the walls. The broken threshold represents the total failure of human protection. The city was left as a series of battered ruins, where the wild was allowed back in to reclaim the marble halls of the elite. Only the essential remnant clings to the branch. Verse 13.
For thus shall it be in the midst of the earth, among the peoples, like an olive tree that has been shaken, or like the few grapes left on the vine after the harvest is over.
But now, look at what remains. The olive tree was shaken, the vine was stripped, and yet a few olives clung to the branch. A few grapes remained on the vine, not because they were stronger, because they were the essence, the oil, the wine. Everything external was stripped away, and what was left was refined. This shaking is the nokef, a radical sifting that marks the beginning of a deeper refinement. The olive, zayit, represents wisdom, chokmah, and the grape, geffen, represents understanding, binah. This was the moment the ancient world hit rock bottom. Half the population gone, the silence total. Yet in the silence that followed, a tiny remnant survived. These were the gleanings, those who were isolated geographically in remote mountains or spiritually in the rising monasteries. They carried the oil of classical knowledge and the wine of faith into the dark tunnel of the coming centuries. The external grandeur of Rome was gone, but the essential essence of humanity was being refined, pressed, and preserved for a future age. Defiant voices rise from the edges of the sea. Verse 14.
They lift up their voice, they shout for joy. From the sea they cry out over the majesty of God.
But here's where it turns. After years of silence, something extraordinary begins. A sound. Not from the forums, not from the palaces, from the coastlines. The survivors move toward the water, not to flee, to praise. They lift their voices, not in the old arrogance, but in sheer, desperate survival. The sea that once carried plague and ash now carries a different vibration, recognition of a majesty that just dismantled their entire world. Slow down and look at this moment. For the first time in the chapter, humanity is no longer described as collapsing, fleeing, or mourning. Now, they answer. This is the birth of a new communal ritual. In the West, something extraordinary happens. A new prayer form, the litany, emerges, a vocal prayer designed for the open air. In 559 AD, the Emperor Justinian himself leads a massive procession through the streets of Byzantium. It is a humble, rhythmic acknowledgement of a power far greater than his own. Thousands of voices join in the Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, a collective cry that serves to break the spiritual and psychological silence of the 536 darkness. And it wasn't just one community. The same sound erupted from two different worlds at the same time. Under the weight of imperial decrees and the shadowed sky, the Piyut is born. Yanai, a liturgical poet, begins composing hymns, crafting sophisticated vocal anthems that lift up the voice to protect the faith when the study of law was forbidden. The Kedusha, the Holy, Holy, Holy anthem, is expanded into a soaring public shout. It is a sonic defense mechanism. By proclaiming the cosmic sovereignty of God over the high people and the failing empires, the community finds a way to stand firm while the ground beneath them is still trembling. This roar from the coast isn't nostalgia. It isn't mourning. It's defiance. People who have lost everything choosing to praise the one who took it all. They don't wait for the darkness to end. They enter it. And in the darkest hour, the ancient world ever knew, they sang. Survivors find clarity within the returning refined light. Verse 15.
Therefore, in the lights give glory to the Lord, in the coastlands of the sea, the name of the Lord, the God of Israel.
The sun has at last recovered its habitual splendor. We see our shadows again in the full light of day. We must now give thanks to the ruler of the seasons, who has restored the light that we thought was lost forever. As the sky clears, the Urim, the lights, take on new meaning. Mystically, this refers not just to the sun, but to the fires that allowed for survival during the dark years. In the Hebrew tradition, Urim implies clarity, a moment where the hiding of the face, verse 1, is replaced by a direct revelation of truth. In Britain, Ireland, Sicily, Cyprus, tiny communities raise their heads. The global network of the Roman world has been severed, turning these communities into islands of memory. Yet in their isolation, they acknowledge the name. Urim refers to the clarity of the glowing stones of the high priest that provided answers from the divine. After the chaos, the survivors finally begin to understand the why of the disaster. They give glory not because the danger is gone, but because they have been refined in the fire of the catastrophe. Historically, this corresponds to the return of stability. Cassiodorus wrote, as if the God of Israel had simply turned the dial back. The covenant of seasons, suspended since 536, was now restored. For those few who remained, the first shadows cast in the full light of day were a signal to recognize the God of Israel, the source of the very physical laws that had once been suspended. Internal decay and treachery shadow the distant songs. Verse 16.
From the ends of the earth we hear songs, glory to the righteous one. But I said, I waste away, woe is me. The traitors have betrayed. With great treachery the traitors have betrayed.
But the praise is fractured, and here's why. While thin, distant voices from the coastlines attempt to lift a song of glory, the inhabitants of this 6th century world are gripped by a profound, internal decay. Humanity here is at a moment of total psychological and physical exhaustion. In the Hebrew, Razi Lee carries the heavy secret of a population hollowed out by the 536 famine and the subsequent plague. John of Ephesus wept over a reaper that mowed and laid down innumerable people, leaving a world so emaciated that humanity itself seemed to be evaporating. And it is from this physical leanness that the social pack finally collapses into treachery. Bogdim Bagadu. Under the extreme pressure of the long winter, the basic covenants of neighbourly care dissolve. Neighbours betray one another for a scrap of food. Officials betray the public to hoard what remains. This is the great treachery of a society that has lost its moral glue, a world where, like the looter dying at the threshold, men betray the social contract for a wealth that has lost all meaning in a dying world. Escaping the cold leads only to the pit. Verse 17.
Fright and the pit and the trap are waiting for you, O inhabitant of the earth.
Now we reach the point where there was simply nowhere left to stand. Humanity enters a vertical pincer, a chain reaction of disasters where every escape route led deeper into the catastrophe. First comes the terror, pashad. This is the psychological shadow, the atmospheric dread of a sun that has gone dark. For over a year, the inhabitants lived under a ghostly sky, convinced that the laws of nature had been permanently revoked. John of Ephesus wrote, "Every man lost hope of living and was afraid to go out, saying, 'I shall perish in the middle of the house.' When they were obliged to go out, the one who went out wrote a tablet with these words that he hung on his arm, 'I am such a one, son of such a one. If I die for God's sake, let them know at my house.'" And then something even more devastating, burial systems overwhelmed, with trenches dug as death outpaced burial. But as the terror of the cold drives the population to move, they walk straight into the pit, Pashat. In the 6th century, these were the literal mass graves of the Justinian Plague. This was not a quiet end. Procopius describes the horror at Sekai. They brought the corpses to the towers of the fortifications, and having removed the roofs from them, they threw the bodies there in complete disorder. An evil stench was reaching the city and was distressing the inhabitants. The pit was no longer a grave, it was a tower, filled with the disorder of the end. Finally, we see the trap, Pak. This is the absolute collapse of the rituals that define humanity. If a survivor managed to evade the frost and the tower of corpses, they are snared by the death of their own civilization. Procopius records the end of funerals. At that time, all the customary rites of burial were neglected, for the dead were not carried out by a procession, nor were the customary songs chanted over them, but it was sufficient if one carried a dead man on his shoulders to the parts of the city which bordered on the sea and cast him down there. The trap is the loss of humanity, where the living simply discard the dead into the sea, caught in a snare of survival that has stripped away the very songs that made them human. The sky falls while the foundations below fracture. Verse 18.
And it shall be, whoever flees from the sound of terror will fall into the pit, and whoever comes up from the midst of the pit will be caught in the snare. For windows from on high are opened, and the foundations of the earth shake.
Here's the devastating truth. Survival instinct was useless when the earth that once sustained you now hunts you, as though the structure holding the world together had fractured. Those who managed to flee the sound of terror, the howling winds of the famine winter, often find their journey ending in the pit. They escape the hunger only to be harvested by the plague. And for those few who crawl out from the midst of the pit, the walking ghosts who survived the comatose state of the fever, they find no sanctuary. They emerge into a world that has been snared by socio-economic collapse, where the survivors find themselves in a deeper trap of debt, isolation, and a shattered social order. It is a biological and structural dead end. But the trap wasn't just horizontal, it was vertical. In the Hebrew, this is arubot mimarom, the same terrifying language used in the account of Noah's flood. But in the 6th century, these windows did not pour out water. They poured out a suffocating veil of sulfuric ash and volcanic dust. Modern climatologists view this as a series of massive volcanic eruptions that threw enough material into the stratosphere to create a volcanic winter. And as the sky fell, the foundations of the earth began to shake. This was one of the most violently seismic periods in recorded history. The foundations, the stone cities and harbour walls of the Roman world, were being physically dismantled from below. In 536, the earth was a vertical pincer, ash falling from the windows above and the ground splitting from the foundations below. There was quite simply nowhere left for people to stand. Material reality dissolves, shattering the collective human ego. Verse 19.
The earth is utterly broken. The earth is clean dissolved. The earth is moved exceedingly.
Now look at the ground beneath your feet. The ground itself stopped being solid, and the spiritual sifting of humanity. In the 6th century, the ground beneath your feet stopped being a platform for life. The earth is utterly broken. Roa hitroa. On a literal level, this describes the structural failure of the very root. The ground itself stopped being solid as marble forums shatter like glass and harbour walls fold into the cold sea. Yet, on a deeper level, this breaking is the shattering of the vessel of the human ego. The rigid, arrogant structures of the old world framework are being broken to pieces because they can no longer hold the light of a new era. The earth has completely crumbled, reduced to fragments. Marble forums shatter, harbour walls fold into the sea. Whatever held the old world together is being ripped apart. This isn't refinement, this is demolition, this is the shattering of a world, por hitporera. Finally, the earth is moved exceedingly, mot hitmoteta. This is the final violent tremor, a shaking of the world's very roots. This is no mere surface vibration, it is a fundamental displacement. It is the shaking off of the wicked, much like a gardener shaking a tree to rid it of rot. The earth is in a state of violent motion, ensuring that only the fruit firmly attached to the righteous source remains, while the dross of the old order is cast down. The empire staggers, lurching toward its final collapse. Verse 20.
The earth staggers like a drunk man and sways like a watchman's hut. Its transgression lies heavy upon it, and it falls, never to rise again.
Look at this image carefully. Not a collapse, a stagger. Isaiah doesn't describe a sudden detonation. He describes something trying to hold itself together and failing. A drunk man doesn't fall all at once. He lurches. He grabs for the wall. He convinces himself he's still standing. That's Rome in the 6th century. The image of the sukkah, the watchman's hut, is devastating in its precision. A sukkah is not built to last. It's a temporary shelter, deliberately fragile, meant to remind its inhabitants that permanence is an illusion. The Roman Empire had convinced itself it was stone. Isaiah says, "You were always a sukkah. You just forgot." Now look at what's happening simultaneously in the sky. The sun, already dimmed to a ghost, behaves as though it has lost its authority. Cassiodorus, writing from Ravenna around 538 AD, records what may be the most haunting astronomical observation in late antiquity. The sun appeared bluish, casting shadows at noon that looked like evening. The moon, when it appeared at all, gave off a reddish, blood-like hue. To the survivors, the celestial order itself seemed to be recoiling, as if the lights of heaven were embarrassed to shine over what the earth had become. And the kings. Let's name them, because Isaiah says they fall, and they did, one by one, like towers in an earthquake. Gelimer, king of the Vandals, the man who controlled North Africa and the western Mediterranean trade routes, was chased into the mountains of Numidia by Belisarius in 533. He surrendered in 534, weeping. He was paraded through the streets of Constantinople in a triumph, then pensioned off to an estate in Galatia. The man who had ruled Carthage died a footnote. Witiges, king of the Ostrogoths, who had held Rome itself, surrendered to Belisarius in 540, was brought to Constantinople, given the honorary title of patrician, and disappeared from history. The King of Rome, a decoration in someone else's court. Khosrow I of Persia, who appeared to be the one great survivor, the one ruler who seemed to thrive, was struck by the plague in his own palace. His armies, which had pushed deep into Syria, found themselves harvesting corpses instead of tribute. The man who boasted of surpassing Solomon watched his treasury emptied by a war he couldn't finish against an empire that was itself half dead. And Justinian, the great builder, the codifier of Roman law, the man who completed the Hagia Sophia and declared the eternal restoration of the empire, contracted the plague himself in 542. He survived, barely. But something didn't survive with him. The man who emerged from that fever was not the man who went in. His generals noted it, his court noted it. The ambition remained, but the coherence was gone. He spent his final decades issuing theological decrees that confused and alienated his own church, while his reconquered territories quietly slipped away. This is the stagger. This is the sukkah swaying. Not one clean blow, a decade of lurching, grasping, falling, and the slow, humiliating recognition that the structure was never as solid as it looked. The transgression lies heavy. Avon kavod. The same root as kavod, glory. The weight of the sin becomes the counterweight that brings down the structure. It's an almost physical image, the moral debt of a civilization accumulated over centuries, finally tipping the scales. And it falls, never to rise again. Not Rome as geography, Rome as idea. The idea that one empire, one law code, one emperor could hold the entire world in a single fist. That idea hit the ground in the 6th century and never got back up. The audit goes vertical, judging both heaven and earth. Verse 21.
And it shall be in that day, the Lord will call to account the host of the height in the height, and the kings of the earth on the earth.
The judgment is no longer just terrestrial, it goes vertical. Isaiah describes a simultaneous trial of the cosmos and the crown. The host of the height refers to the literal disruption of the sun, moon, and seasons. To the people on the ground in 536, it felt as though the celestial authorities had been summoned to court and found guilty. When the sun lost its heat and the sky turned blue-grey for 18 months, the very ordinances of heaven appeared to be on trial. The light that was supposed to be a guaranteed part of the Noahide contract was suddenly being called to account. Simultaneously, the kings of the earth face a total decapitation of authority. This wasn't just a Roman crisis, it was global. The Sassanid Empire in Persia, the Liang dynasty in China, the Gupta Empire in India. Every major power structure on the planet hit a wall in the 540s. The plague didn't respect borders or sacred authority. It sought out the height. It struck the palace as efficiently as the gutter, proving that the highest authority on the earth was nothing compared to the power that had just suspended the sun. The kings weren't just being defeated, they were being audited. History becomes a dungeon for the rounded-up kings. Verse 22.
They will be rounded up like prisoners in a dungeon. They will be locked away in a pit and punished after many days.
The rounding up is the detail that stops you. Not executed, not destroyed, rounded up, like cattle, like men who no longer pose a threat to anyone. Gelimer again, because his story deserves the full weight Isaiah gives it. When Procopius describes the final surrender, he captures something almost unbearable. Gelimer came down from the mountain where he had been hiding for months, half-starved, wrapped in rags. Before he surrendered, he sent a message to Belisarius, not asking for mercy, not negotiating terms. He asked for a sponge, a loaf of bread, and a lyre. A sponge for his eyes, swollen from weeping. Bread, because he had forgotten what real food tasted like, and a lyre, because he wanted to set his grief to music before the end. That is your dungeon, not iron bars. A man on a mountainside asking for a lyre so he can mourn his own kingdom before handing himself over. Witiges was taken to Constantinople and displayed. The Goths, who had held Rome for generations, who had absorbed Roman culture, Roman law, Roman aesthetics, were now curios in a Byzantine court. Their weapons hung on palace walls as decoration. Their royal bloodlines were absorbed, married off, diluted into irrelevance within 2 generations. But the dungeon was also geographical, and this is where the verse opens into something larger. Across the Central Asian steppes, entire confederations of nomadic peoples found themselves sealed inside a vault of ice and cold. The Avars, who had been one of the most fearsome horse peoples of the age, were effectively frozen in place during the worst years. Their mobility, the very thing that made them terrifying, was neutralized by a climate that turned the open steppe into a killing field. The same cold that emptied the granaries of Constantinople locked the barbarian world in its own prison. And then there is the strangest dungeon of all, the dungeon of prolonged survival. Justinian lived until 565 AD. He outlasted nearly everyone. He watched his great general Belisarius stripped of his command, disgraced, and die in obscurity. He watched the Italy he had reconquered at such devastating cost immediately begin to slip away, the year after his death. He spent decades issuing edicts about the nature of Christ that nobody agreed with, growing increasingly isolated in a palace that felt more like a cell with every passing year. Locked away in a pit and punished after many days. The punishment wasn't always swift. Sometimes it was the long, slow punishment of watching everything you built dissolve while you were still alive to see it. The phrase "after many days," Lashar Yamim Rabim, carries a specific weight in prophetic language. It implies a delayed reckoning, a sentence served not in a single moment, but across a long, grinding stretch of time. History itself becomes the dungeon. The kings of the old world don't just fall. They linger in a kind of suspended humiliation, stripped of context, stripped of meaning. Their names preserved only because they were present at the moment the ancient world ended. Gelimer asked for a lyre. He got it. We don't know what he played, but the world he played it for was already gone. A different dawn breaks, fueled by indestructible radiance. Verse 23.
Then the moon will be embarrassed and the sun ashamed, for the Lord of hosts will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and before his elders in glory.
We reach the resolution of the 536 darkness. The focus shifts from the failing lights of nature to the unfailing light of the King. This is the final theological answer to the hour of crisis. By 546 AD, the physical sun and moon appeared embarrassed and ashamed. The sun, the very entity that turned into a ghost for 18 months, the thing that terrified every witness on the planet, now recoils. In the presence of a greater radiance, the celestial engine that failed humanity is seen for what it is, temporary and subject to suspension. A mere shadow compared to the majesty revealed through the crisis. As the physical engine of the sky faltered, the focus of the story shifted toward a different kind of illumination. In the midst of this global contraction, the Lord began to reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, not through physical walls, but through the Spirit. This era closely overlaps with the final shaping and transmission of the Babylonian Talmud. While the eternal city of Rome swayed like a shack, the Jewish center of Zion remained the spiritual anchor of the survivors. The elders mentioned here, the Savarim and the rabbis who finalized the Talmud, were brought into the presence of true glory. The Savarim, the explainers, like Rav Giza and Rav Simuna, preserved the final structure of the oral law precisely when the world was coming apart. Why is this called indestructible? Because while fire, flood, plague and earthquake could dismantle the stone cities of Rome and Byzantium, a transmitted text survives any catastrophe. Every witness in this story watched the physical sun fail. Procopius saw it dim. Cassiodorus saw it turn blue. John of Ephesus watched the light leave the world. But none of them could see what was being written by candlelight in the study halls of Sura and Pumbedita, a text that would outlive every empire, every plague, every volcano, every dark age. A light that doesn't depend on the atmosphere. A light that survives because it was never physical to begin with. The sun went dim. The Torah stayed bright. This is the resolution of the entire problem presented in verse 20. There the heavy transgression was the weight that crashed the earth. Here the kavod, the weight and glory of God, arrives to replace it. The kavod is the ultimate counterweight. It provides a spiritual light that does not depend on the atmosphere or the sun. It was an indestructible radiance that would guide humanity through the long exile, shining even when the physical world was choked with ash. The breaking of the covenant explains the end of antiquity. The empire was not conquered. It was dismantled by the very nature it had tried to dominate. What looked like random catastrophe was, in Isaiah's framework, a covenantal correction, the earth contracting back to its foundations when the weight of accumulated transgression finally tipped the scales. The vine had to be stripped bare before new growth was possible. The old vessel had to shatter before the light inside it could be transferred to something more durable. This is not destruction for its own sake. It is the necessary clearing of ground. A world built on the illusion of permanence had to be returned to its essential elements before a world built on something real could begin. And in the silence that followed, the world witnessed not just the death of an empire, but the birth of a more resilient soul. The survivors who emerged from the volcanic winter were not the people who went in. They had been pressed like olives, stripped like vines, shaken until only what was essential remained. What they carried forward, the transmitted text, the liturgical voice, the memory of what justice once looked like, would outlast every king named in this chapter. Remember Procopius, standing in the shadow of Caesarea, watching the sun lose its strength. He recorded what he saw with precision and terror. But he could not see what was being written by candlelight in the study halls of Sura and Pumbedita, while the sky above him went dark. He was watching the wrong light. The sun went dim, but the light never went out.